Have you ever watched someone hurt you, lie to you, or completely shut down on you, and then act like absolutely nothing happened? Like you're the dramatic one just for bringing it up at all. You sit there afterward, replaying the whole thing in your head, wondering if maybe you overreacted, maybe you imagined the whole tone of it, maybe somehow you're actually the problem here, and the part that really gets under your skin is how calm they seem through all of it, almost annoyingly composed while you're quietly falling apart inside. That composure isn't an accident, it isn't confidence, and it definitely isn't peace. What you're actually witnessing is a very specific, very predictable psychological defense mechanism playing out right in front of you. And once you understand what's actually happening underneath that calm exterior, you'll never read that kind of behavior the same way again. Here's the piece most people never quite grasp. When someone with an avoidant attachment style knows deep down that they've done something wrong, they don't fall apart with apologies and tears and heartfelt accountability the way you might expect or hope for. Instead, they do something far more calculated, far more disorienting, and honestly, in a lot of ways, more damaging than whatever they did in the first place. By the time we get through this, you'll understand exactly what these moves look like, why they happen, what they actually mean, and maybe most importantly, what it says about you that you kept trying so hard to reach someone who kept slipping out of reach. Let's start from the ground up, because to really understand what an avoidant person does when they know they're guilty, you first have to understand how guilt actually registers inside their nervous system. And it's wildly different from how most people experience it. For the average person, guilt works like a signal. It's uncomfortable, sure, but it points somewhere useful. It says something like, I did something wrong here, I need to make this right, I need to reconnect with the person I hurt. For emotionally secure people, guilt is basically the bridge back to closeness. It's the thing that drives repair. But for someone with avoidant patterns, guilt doesn't function that way at all. It's not a bridge for them. It's a threat. It signals that they're about to be exposed, confronted, emotionally flooded, and trapped inside a conversation they simply don't have the tools to navigate. Their nervous system isn't whispering, fix this. It's screaming, get out. And this is where things get genuinely personal for a lot of people watching or reading this, because the avoidant person didn't choose to become this way out of cruelty. They were shaped into it, usually starting way back in childhood. Somewhere along the way, they likely learned that expressing guilt, remorse, or vulnerability got them punished, humiliated, or thrown into emotional chaos. Maybe they grew up somewhere where admitting fault meant getting torn apart. Emotionally, verbally, sometimes worse. So they adapted. They learned that the safest possible move when you've done something wrong is to act as though you haven't. Not because they're unaware, they know. But knowing and feeling safe have become mutually exclusive experiences for them. Now here's the part worth sitting with, because what's coming next explains something that has probably made a lot of you question your own sanity at some point. The behaviors avoidant people default to when they're guilty are so specific, so consistent, and so psychologically sophisticated that most people on the receiving end spend years believing they were the problem, years of their life genuinely convinced it was them. So stick with this, because it's about to get real. The first thing an avoidant person tends to do once they know they're guilty is quietly rewrite the story, not necessarily out loud and not right away. It usually happens internally first. They mentally return to the events and reconstruct the whole narrative in a way that repositions themselves as either the victim or at least neutral. This isn't lying in the deliberate, calculated sense most people imagine. It's a deeply ingrained psychological process, something closer to cognitive distortion, and for them it's almost automatic. They actually start to believe their own revised version. They'll remember your tone as sharper than it actually was. They'll remember their own behavior as more justified than it was, and when they finally present this version to you, they'll do it with total conviction, because in that moment, to them, it is true. This is exactly why conversations with a guilty avoidant person can leave you feeling like you're losing your mind. You remember one thing clearly. They remember something completely different. You've got the receipts, the timestamps, the memory burned into your nervous system, and they're looking back at you with this calm, almost pitying look, like you're the confused one, like you're the irrational one. A lot of people would call this gaslighting, and while that word gets thrown around too casually these days, in this specific context, it fits. The distinction worth noting is that a narcissist gaslights on purpose, as a deliberate power move. An avoidant person often gaslights because they genuinely cannot afford psychologically to hold on to the real version of events. The truth feels too dangerous to their sense of who they are. And here's something crucial to understand about avoidant people in general. Their entire internal framework rests on one core belief, that they are fundamentally unworthy of love. Underneath all the composure, underneath the walls and the self-sufficiency, there's usually a frightened kid in there somewhere who believes that if you truly fully saw them, you'd leave. So when they mess up, the guilt isn't just, I made a mistake. It becomes, I just proved I'm unlovable, and that's an unbearable feeling to sit with. So their mind protects itself. The story gets rewritten, the guilt gets buried, and you're left standing in the wreckage, baffled at how they can seem so detached from something that feels enormous to you. The second behavior is what I'd call strategic withdrawal, and it's maddening for anyone who loves someone who does this. Once an avoidant person knows they've done something wrong, they retreat, they put up distance. Suddenly they're extremely busy, extremely unavailable, hyper-focused on work, hobbies, literally anything that isn't you. And if you lean anxious or secure in your own attachment style, your instinct is to move toward them, to reach out, talk it through, resolve it, which sets off a brutal pattern. The guiltier they feel, the more you pursue, and the more you pursue, the more they retreat. Before long, you're doing all the emotional heavy lifting, while they seem to barely register that you exist. But here's what's actually going on underneath that withdrawal. They're not unbothered, they're overwhelmed. The distance isn't indifference, it's regulation. They're creating physical or emotional space between themselves and the guilt, because being near you means being confronted with what they did, what it means, and what it might cost them. Every message you send becomes a reminder. Every attempt at conversation feels like an intrusion into the fortress they're desperately trying to rebuild. So they go quiet, they go cold, and you spiral into anxiety and self-blame, wondering endlessly what you did wrong, which tragically takes all the pressure completely off of them. There's something almost cruelly effective about this dynamic when you step back and look at it. Withdrawing doesn't just shield the avoidant person from confrontation, it activates your attachment system so intensely that within a short period you stop talking about their guilt entirely and start focusing purely on getting them back. The conversation shifts from, "You hurt me and I deserve an apology," to, "Please just talk to me again." And somewhere in their nervous system, not always consciously, they've learned that if they just wait it out long enough, the crisis passes without them ever having to be accountable for anything at all. The third behavior is minimization, and this one is so specific, so consistent across avoidant people, that once you learn to spot it, you'll start seeing it everywhere. When they're finally cornered into a conversation about what happened, they minimize, not just the offense itself, but your feelings about it too. You'll hear things like, "You're being too sensitive," or "I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of this," or "That was ages ago, why are you still bringing it up?" Or, "I already apologized, what more do you want from me?" And they'll say all of it with this bewildered, almost frustrated energy, like you're the unreasonable one, like your pain is the actual problem rather than the thing that caused it. This isn't just deflection, it's a survival strategy. If they can convince you and themselves that what happened wasn't really that bad, the guilt shrinks proportionally. If you're overreacting, they don't have to feel as terrible. If your pain seems excessive, their responsibility feels smaller. The minimization isn't necessarily meant to hurt you further, even though it absolutely does. It's meant to make the emotional terrain survivable for someone with almost zero capacity to sit with shame. And that distinction between guilt and shame matters enormously here. Guilt says, "I did something bad." Shame says, "I am bad." Guilt is something you can actually work with. It can lead to accountability and repair. Shame is paralyzing. It makes people defensive, sometimes aggressive, often withdrawn, and frequently dishonest, because admitting to the act feels like admitting to being fundamentally flawed. For avoidant people who already carry that deep belief in their own unworthiness, shame isn't just uncomfortable, it feels existential, almost like annihilation. So they fight it with everything available to them, minimizing, reframing, retreating, deflecting blame, anything to keep that feeling at a safe distance. The fourth behavior is projection, and this is where things get particularly confusing and painful for everyone involved. Projection happens when someone takes an uncomfortable feeling inside themselves and assigns it to someone else instead. When a guilty avoidant person projects, the entire dynamic flips. Suddenly, you're not the one who got hurt, you're the one attacking them. Your attempt to have an honest conversation becomes, "You always make everything about you." Your expression of pain becomes, "You're being manipulative." Your need for accountability becomes, "You just love playing the victim." This kind of disorientation is nearly impossible to describe unless you've actually lived through it, because you show up hurting, vulnerable, genuinely trying to reconnect, and within minutes you find yourself defending your own character instead of talking about what actually happened. The subject has completely shifted. Suddenly, the conversation is about your flaws, your patterns, your supposed toxicity, and they're the ones on the offensive, pushing forward with this energy that feels almost righteous, almost genuinely wounded. And because you're someone with empathy and a habit of self-reflection, you start to wonder, wait, am I doing that? Am I actually being manipulative? Have I been the problem this whole time? That self-doubt isn't a coincidence. It's the single most effective defense mechanism in the avoidant toolkit, not because they sat down and strategized it, but because it simply works. Every time you turn that critical eye inward, they buy themselves more time. Every time you end up apologizing for how you expressed your pain, they slip further away from ever being accountable for what actually caused it. And this is where the real psychological damage builds up, not just within a single relationship, but sometimes across years, even decades. People who've loved avoidant partners for extended stretches often develop a kind of chronic self-doubt. They get so used to having their reality questioned, their feelings shrunk down, and their needs twisted into accusations that they eventually stop trusting themselves at all. They lose track of what's reasonable. They lose track of what's even real. The fifth behavior is what I'd call the breadcrumb apology, and I want to slow down here because this one offers hope in the cruelest way possible. At some point, usually when they sense you're genuinely about to walk away, or when the guilt has piled up to a level even they can't fully suppress anymore, the avoidant person will offer something that resembles an apology. Maybe it's a text that says, "I'm sorry things got complicated." Maybe it's a quiet moment where they say, "I know I haven't been easy lately." Maybe it's something bigger, a gift, a favor, a sudden burst of affection out of nowhere, and your heart, which has been starving for some kind of acknowledgement, leaps at it because you've been waiting and needing this for so long, and it finally feels like they see you. But watch closely. The breadcrumb apology almost never contains anything specific. It doesn't say, "I lied to you about this exact thing, and I understand why that hurt you." It doesn't say, "I pulled away right when you needed me most, and I can see how that made you feel abandoned." Instead, it says something vague, something that could technically apply to anything. "I'm sorry if you felt hurt," instead of, "I'm sorry I hurt you." That one small word swap, if versus that, carries a whole universe of non-accountability inside it. It shifts the hurt into your perception rather than their actions. It apologizes for your feeling instead of for their behavior. And most people, so desperate for any kind of repair at all, accept it anyway. They say, "Thank you, that means a lot," and soak in that brief warmth. Meanwhile, the avoidant person, consciously or not, quietly files the whole thing under resolved and moves forward, like the thing that caused all this pain never happened. This cycle, hurt, withdrawal, minimization, breadcrumb apology, brief warmth, then right back to the original pattern, can run for years, sometimes decades, because at every point where it should naturally collapse, that little hit of warmth is just enough to reset the clock. It's enough to keep you there, but never enough to actually heal you. And the avoidant person never develops the tools they'd need to genuinely change, because the system keeps functioning exactly as it was built to. Now I want to talk about something that rarely comes up in conversations about avoidant attachment, what all of this does to the avoidant person internally over time, because they are not actually fine. I know the composure looks infuriatingly solid from the outside, but inside someone avoidant who has genuinely hurt someone they care about, there's often a quiet, chronic, corrosive self-loathing they'll rarely express and might not even fully recognize themselves. They can't sit with the guilt, so they bury it. But buried guilt doesn't just disappear, it calcifies. It becomes part of their internal architecture, a heaviness they carry without being able to name, a distance they maintain without fully understanding why, a pattern of self-sabotage that keeps reinforcing the very story they already believe about themselves. Some avoidant people drink, some throw themselves obsessively into work. Some drift from relationship to relationship, not because they're heartless, but because staying long enough to truly be known feels scarier than the loneliness of starting over yet again. All that unprocessed guilt piles up underneath the controlled exterior and slowly erodes their capacity for real intimacy, because real intimacy requires being seen, and being seen risks letting the guilt surface. And if the guilt surfaces, the shame follows right behind it. The one thing they've organized their entire existence around never having to feel. So in a real, genuinely tragic sense, their inability to face their own guilt doesn't just hurt the people who love them. It slowly hollows out their own capacity to live fully. They become more defended, more isolated, essentially building their own kind of psychological solitary confinement, getting better and better at the surface of connection while losing more and more access to its actual depth. And the people who love them, who catch glimpses of who they could be in those rare open moments, keep holding on to hope that this time will be different, that the walls will finally come down, that the love will finally be enough. Here's what psychology tells us, and what countless people's lived experience confirms as well. The walls don't come down just because you love harder. They don't come down because you're patient enough, understanding enough, or forgiving enough. If they come down at all, it's because the avoidant person themselves chooses to do the genuinely uncomfortable, genuinely threatening work of examining why those walls exist in the first place. That usually means therapy. That means learning to sit with shame instead of running from it. That means staying inside difficult conversations long past the point where every instinct is screaming at them to flee. That is not something you can do for them. Your love, no matter how deep, cannot do that work on their behalf. And accepting that truth is one of the most painful things a person can come to terms with, because it means the outcome was never fully in your hands, no matter how much you poured in. But here's where I want to bring this back around to you, because honestly, this was never really just about them. It was always about you and what you choose to do with all of this now. Because understanding avoidant guilt doesn't just explain their behavior. It explains your experience too. It explains why you felt like you were losing your mind, why you kept apologizing for simply being in pain, why you worked so hard trying to have conversations that seemed to go absolutely nowhere, why you shrank your own needs down just to make space for someone who could never quite fill the space you were both trying to build together. You were not wrong for wanting accountability. You were not being dramatic for needing to be acknowledged. You were not weak for hoping the person who hurt you might just once fully understand the impact of what they did. None of that is a character flaw. Those are the basic requirements of healthy human connection. And here's maybe the most important thing I can say to you directly. The fact that they couldn't give you accountability doesn't mean you didn't deserve it. The fact that they minimized your pain doesn't mean your pain wasn't real. The fact that they rewrote the story doesn't mean your version was wrong. The fact that they projected their guilt onto you doesn't mean you were the toxic one. You may have absorbed so much of their unprocessed shame that it's become tangled up with your own sense of self, indistinguishable from it. And that, honestly, is the deepest wound an avoidant relationship can leave. Not just the broken trust, not just the confusion, but the quiet way it convinces you that your needs are too much, your feelings are too intense, and your desire for real connection is somehow a flaw in you. It isn't. It never was. It's actually the most human thing about you. There's one more piece I want to cover before wrapping up, and it might be the most subtle and honestly the most significant. It's what tends to happen after the relationship ends, after the cycle finally breaks, after whatever resolution or dissolution eventually occurs. A lot of avoidant people, once they're alone, once the distance has quieted the guilt enough for them to glance at it sideways, will reach back out. Out of nowhere, a message shows up. After months of silence, they like an old photo. They start appearing carefully at the edges of your life again, not enough to actually commit to anything, but enough to signal the door is still there. And it feels like something. It feels significant, like maybe they've changed, maybe they've grown, maybe this time will actually be different. And sometimes, honestly, it is. Sometimes real growth does happen in solitude. Sometimes the distance that once felt like abandonment was actually the only kind of processing they knew how to do. Slow, private, away from the pressure of the relationship itself. And sometimes people genuinely do the work and come back different. You don't have to write off that possibility entirely, but you do need to evaluate it with clear eyes, based on actual behavior rather than hope alone. Because hope without discernment is exactly how people end up in the same cycle 3 years later, having the same conversation in a different apartment, still waiting on an apology that almost lands and then dissolves before it fully arrives. What you deserve, what you have always deserved, is someone capable of staying in the discomfort of having hurt you long enough to actually repair it. Someone who can say, plainly and specifically, I was wrong, and here's what I'm going to do differently. Someone whose guilt pulls them toward you instead of pushing them away. Someone who doesn't need you to shrink your pain just so they can survive knowing they caused it. That is not an unreasonable standard to hold. That's simply the baseline of accountable love, and truly internalizing that, not just understanding it intellectually, but knowing it in your bones, is where something new begins. It's the beginning of no longer settling for partial presence, no longer mistaking withdrawal for mystery, no longer confusing emotional unavailability with depth, no longer making yourself smaller just to fit inside whatever limited space someone's avoidance was willing to allow you. Understanding avoidant guilt doesn't mean you have to become cold or cynical toward the people who carry it. Plenty of them are genuinely trying in the only ways their current wiring allows. Plenty of them do love in a fragmented, defended, limited way, shaped entirely by what their psychology currently permits. Holding compassion for that reality isn't weakness, it's actually maturity. But compassion for them and clarity about what you need are not opposites. You can fully understand why someone can't give you what you need and still decide that you need it anyway. You can hold real empathy for someone's wounds and still refuse to make your home inside them. So here's what I want to leave you with, and I mean this genuinely, not as an abstract idea, but as an actual question about your own life. Think about the person this brought to mind, because I'd bet someone did. Think back to the moments where you felt like you were losing your grip on reality, where you apologized simply for having feelings, where you chased someone's withdrawal and lost track of the fact that you were the one who'd actually been hurt. And ask yourself honestly, without turning it into an attack on them or on yourself, how much of who you became during or after that relationship was shaped by carrying guilt that was never actually yours to carry? Because that question does have an answer. And whatever your answer turns out to be, it's the beginning of reclaiming something that was quietly taken from you. Not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, across hundreds of small moments where your reality got questioned, and out of love, you chose to doubt yourself instead.